Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22 on the insert. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you.
Thanks, Luke. Luke is a direct descendant of one of the Nephilim, so he has to adjust the microphone accordingly. Luke, thanks for reading so well. Let me add my welcome to everybody's today. It's really, really good to see you all, and thanks for braving the snow, which looks like it might provide a little bit of fun for us after our time together today. Do keep Genesis 28 open. That's where we will spend our time. I think our default position as human beings is to think that God, if he even exists, wants us to do something for him, wants us to make the effort to relate to him correctly and jump through, no doubt, a series of hoops. Most people, of course, dismiss Christianity before it even gets a hearing because they think they're going to be presented with a long sort of to-do list and a to-don't list as well. So we hear things like, thanks very much for the invitation as we hold out a guest talk, or maybe just an invitation to our regular Sunday. Thanks for the invitation, but I've got a lot on right now. You see, true Christianity is, of course, different because it is about a God who is committed to his people, a God who is there for us, to help us, to aid us, and to establish us precisely because we are so busy at the moment. And that's the main point of Genesis 28. God is absolutely committed to his people, to us, for a Christian today. And so the application, I hope, where we'll sort of go through today and indeed over the next few weeks, understanding God's commitment to us. That is the starting point for life as God has designed it. Without that, we really are left with nothing more than our own ambitions and, of course, the rather hopeless and heart-wrenching aim of seeking the world's approval for the things that we do. But with that, with the right understanding of the God who made us and who is committed to his people, well, we're in a position to put our feet firmly on this world and make sense of life. Hence our theme today, that God will establish his people. That is absolutely right. We can start then to ask and answer the big questions of life. Life makes sense when we understand who we are and who God is. I think as Christians it's quite possible, isn't it, even if we're familiar with some of these ideas, it's quite possible to think of God as somewhat detached from our day-to-day life. A parent on the sidelines at a sports match, perhaps, shouting out, there, for sure, there, but, occasionally slightly embarrassing sort of contributions from the sidelines, so-called helpful advice. It's easy to think of God a little bit like that sometimes, but that couldn't be further from the truth. You see, God designs the playing field, he designs the players, and he ultimately sends his son to save the day. God is absolutely committed to his people, and the Bible makes that clear at every point. And I hope it's going to be increasingly clear as we join Jacob here in Genesis 28. And what a place to join him. I mean, here he is on the run from his brother. Who knows what's going through his brother's head right now after what Jacob has just done to him. And he's in the middle of nowhere. And he finds a place to sleep. And we get this agitating detail. It's always bothered me. I mean, why would you use a stone for a pillow? Why use the most uncomfortable thing around as a pillow? He must have had a cloak. He must have had a blanket. I mean, he's probably had a camel or something. Anything but the stone. And we don't know why. Maybe it's sort of keep his head away from the scorpions or something in that part of the world. Who knows? Doesn't matter. It's a rather annoying detail, but it's the detail that always stands out in the Bible stories, isn't it? I think I want to draw our attention to the other big detail, the ladder. That's where we're going to spend more of our time. Sometimes translated as stairway, stretching up to heaven. And we'll consider the significance of that under the first point, relationship building. Let's pick up the story in verse 12. And Jacob dreamed, behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it. Now, it's a quite sort of random detail, but massively significant. A ladder reaching to heaven. Now, this is the first time since the fall that there has been a connection between the realm of God and heaven and earth and man. They have remained rightly separated for quite a long time now. So to understand the significance, we really need to go right back to the start. Before the fall, Adam, Eve, they walked with God freely in the Garden in Eden. And so in those days, there was no distinction between heaven and earth. The coexistence of God and man collapsed to the garden. They existed together. They walked together. They talked together. There were still different realms, but there was a coexistence. After the fall, the punishment of separation, a pulling apart, heaven was detached. The reality was God could not coexist with man, perfectly holy God. A rebellious humanity, a separation. And now that has been the state of play for the last 25 chapters, which it could be many, many thousands of years, we don't know exactly, until Jacob's dream, a vision of connection, a connection between heaven and earth. One commentator says an axis of possibility now existed between these realms that had not since the beginning. Now, this is a monumental development in the Bible storyline, a step towards closing the gap. Here is God graciously revealing more of his plan to his people. God slowly showing how it is that God and man will one day coexist. Here's the first step, a ladder. Now, as you sort of sweep through the Bible storyline, we see the development of all of God's promises. It's something that's called progressive revelation. This is the way that God has decided to make himself known to us. More information from God to us as he remains committed in manageable, bite-sized chunks to help us appreciate God's commitment to us. Now, the ladder very obviously stands in contrast to the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel sort of roughly halfway between the fall and, from your perspective, the fall, and where we are now in chapter 28, roughly halfway, around Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, the doomed project. The tower that was built to reach into heaven, what happened? Well, God put a stop to that. Humanity can't climb into heaven. And so the tower and its people dismantled, a legacy to humanity's failure to be able to get to God, to make a name for themselves. Now, if the connection between heaven and earth is to be repaired, it will have to be God's initiative, God coming to us. It will take God's commitment to make himself known to us. The angels on the ladder, perhaps an indicator that this is beginning to happen, that the realm of heaven is beginning to infiltrate earth. There is heavenly activity, and this again builds in Jacob's life. More on that to come. Here, the angels, God's watchfulness and activity. You see, progressive revelation is the way of God graciously dealing with us. It's God's way of allowing us to get to know him in ways that do begin to make sense. See, to be made in the image of God means that we can relate to him like the rest of creation can't. And the way that we are able to relate to him is as God slows down the process of getting to know him through lots of people's real lives, as we see in Jacob. It helps us grasp what God is like. And of course, we can all relate to that, can't we, in different ways, that when things are sort of slowed down and spelt out to us, they begin to make sense. Let me try and illustrate this in, I hope, a slightly entertaining way. I brought a prop, unusually. I asked one of my children to cover it up so it wasn't too distracting. I was given this by a close friend. Some of you will know him, Nick Margison, for Christmas. He thought it would keep me happy over Christmas, me and my family. Needless to say, we haven't made much progress on it until we brought it here, and it's starting to go down quite quickly, particularly when the little children see me holding it. And it was with one such little child, Harvey, many of you will know, 3-year-old Harvey, son to Tom and Emma, who saw me holding it like this. And he came up and was quite interested in talking to me when he saw me holding this and said, "Chris, what's that?" And I said, "Well, these are some sweets." And I said, why don't we share out some sweets? In fact, why don't I take a big handful, say 20, and I could give them out to different people and give you some too. And Harvey was more interested in me at that moment than he's ever been in his life. And I took out a big handful, and I said, well, let's just imagine this. Imagine we had 20. And I said it out like this. I said, and we'll give 2 to Mummy and 2 to Daddy and 2 to Archie. And Harvey stopped me. And he said, my baby brother Archie cannot have sweets, which is very responsible. I thought you'd be proud for me to know that. I haven't fed this back to Tom and Emma yet, although I did warn them I was going to be doing this today, so don't worry, nobody's too shocked. I carried on. So let me just try again, Harvey. So imagine I give 2 to Mummy and 2 to Daddy and 2 to Sam and 2 to Millie and 2 to Imogen. These are all the other children in the church that Harvey knows well. And 2 to Felix and 2 to David and 2 to Imani and 2 to Finn and 2 to me. And then how many will that leave for you, Archie? Harvey. And he said to me, Chris, I don't know. And I'm not surprised. I didn't have a clue either. So I said, well, why don't we try it? So we sort of counted it out. And embarrassingly, by the time, if we did include Archie, we were at -2 when it got to Harvey. That wasn't very good. So I had to sort of manipulate the figures. Anyway, you see the point. By the time it had all finished, we had a very slow counting game. And Harvey, counting in 2s, was able to work out that he had a couple left for himself as well. You see, here's the point. God does not bamboozle us with information when it comes to the most serious project of getting to know him and his plan for us. Through many hundreds, thousands of years, God lays out his plans in ways that we can understand. And Genesis 28 is a massively significant step towards God's progressive revelation of his plans to us. In that process, we learn that God is building relationship with his people. He's committed. And whilst the ladder helps us to see that, ultimately it puts the attention once again on his words. Because ultimately God's commitment is always expressed in words to his people. And that brings us to the second point, promise making. I love the way God takes the initiative. I mean, there is Jacob. What is he doing? He's sound asleep as all of this happens. If ever you want a clear indicator that God doesn't require something of us in the first instance, God takes the initiative. Here he is, sound asleep. And God breaks in and he makes the promise to Jacob and to his offspring, to everyone that would follow. By the end of it, well, Jacob is in no doubt about what he's just been party to. Look at verse 16. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome. none other than the house of God, the gate of heaven. Now, a hugely significant time again for Jacob. First time that Jacob had had the Lord speaking to him directly. No doubt Jacob would have heard many stories about how God had spoken to his grandfather Abraham, to his father Isaac. And the promises that were said to them are now restated, by and large, the same promises to Jacob. Here is God again, demonstrating his commitment. Just have a look, verse 13. I'm the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, the north, the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. There are lots of things we could say about this. The promise here is one way, and I think that's probably the most notable point for us today. It's a one way. That means it's unilateral. In other words, it is God's act of commitment to his people. No strings attached. One way. I will do this, as Jacob lies helpless and asleep in the middle of nowhere. He promises unreservedly to make Jacob into a nation of peoples too numerous to count. God will do it. I will bless you. I will establish you. And it's not dependent on the actions of his people. And by human accounts, that is by no means a given. I mean, Jacob stands in huge contrast to Abraham. Abraham's always held out in the Bible as a bit of a hero. He's the father of many nations. And, well, even in the New Testament, he's somebody that we are encouraged to copy. Have the faith of Abraham, the hero Abraham. He is a good man to model our lives on, says the New Testament. Jacob, by contrast, well, he was the opposite. I mean, the reason he's here in the middle of nowhere with a stone pillow is because he's on the run for his life from his brother, because he's deceived him, he's tricked him. We've been hearing about that over the last few weeks. He has no choice but to run. He's stolen the birthright, he's stolen the inheritance, he's lied to his father. And in the Bible, as far as I'm aware, we are never encouraged to be like Jacob. Jacob, well, is the arch ratbag. But he's beginning to understand the God who has, for some reason, set his desire on him. And by the end, you see Jacob's response. Look at verse 20. Jacob made a vow saying, if. And it's probably worth saying, as you look at the original language, I won't get too technical here, but it's probably not the most helpful translation to say if. This is not Jacob putting a condition on God. You could probably more helpfully translate it as since. Since God will be with me, since God will keep me in this way that I go, and give me the bread to eat and clothing to wear so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. So this is not a model response by any means. And the proper application is not to jump into Jacob's shoes and start setting up pillars and standing orders. Jacob wasn't even required to do that. The Mosaic covenant did talk about tithing and that sort of thing, but that was many, many hundreds of years away. This is just Jacob doing what he thought was right in response to God's revelation to him. So it's not meant to be a model to us. Jacob could begin to see, though, couldn't he? Could begin to grasp the nature, the commitment of the God that had spoken to his grandfather and then to his father. He is faithful to his promises. This is what God is like. This is the sort of commitment that he shows. And this is a God, I'd suggest, that is worth knowing and is knowable. He is a God to throw your life behind, to line up with. It's interesting, isn't it? In our world, I think we are increasingly, as a sort of international, global people, we are increasingly skeptical about hearing anything that's worth properly lining up behind. I read an interesting survey last week by Ipsos. It was conducted in the not-too-distant past, a few months back. It surveyed 27 countries and looked at all types of media, broadsheets, TV news, tabloids, social media, the works. And it looked at different trends of trust in these different forms of media across 27 nations. And particularly over 20 years ago compared to now, there's been a massive shift of distrust. People don't trust any of these sort of sources of information. And over the last 5 years, that distrust is increasing rapidly. We don't believe what we hear. Well, God's not like that. When he says something, he always does it. And that has been true from the very beginning of time. God is trustworthy. And so in huge contrast as Christians, here is a God who sticks to his word. Here are words that, unlike any others in our world, are trustworthy words. Slowly, in God's time, making those words clear to us through progressive revelation. So God is committed. We've seen that in relationship building and promise making. Thirdly, in the fact that he is people-focused. There are two aspects on this which are very simple to grasp but are worth pulling out because people is such a big aspect of this type of promise. And the first is very simply that he promises so many people. You'll remember Abraham had been given that vision, as many as the stars in the sky, as many of the grains of dust on the seashore. Well, Jacob is told the dust of the earth. Simple illustrations which make the point, too many to count. How many offspring did Jacob have? Well, right now, none. He was on the run. He didn't even have a wife. He was the sole member of God's people from his generation down. Well, we're going to see more on that next week. How many of his offspring been since this time? Well, today, as Christians, as we look around the world, it's too many to number, that's the point, isn't it? Who knows what's going on in some of these countries we don't have greater access to, like China, North Korea, where we hear wonderful stories of the church thriving. Thousands of millions, billions of people. You see, God never does things by half measures. When God says he'll do something, he does it. He leaves all the half measures to us. But the second point on people, not just lots, but that it is focused. It becomes very, very personal. And that's wonderful, isn't it? Look at verse 15. Behold, I am with you. I will keep you for wherever you go, will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So personal, but so important for Jacob to grasp. So much of the rest of his life and worry and heartache could have been spared if he had just taken on board the words that God had said to him. And that would be a good principle for us, wouldn't it? If we could just grasp the nature of the words that God has said to his people. Think of Jacob. God wasn't saying for a second that Jacob's life was going to be free from difficulty or heartache. Jacob at the moment, as I've already said, he's running from his brother. Who knows what's going through his head? Probably a desire to kill him. And he's running into the arms of his uncle, Laban, who is about to trick and deceive him over many years. Jacob's life was anything but easy. You wait until next week as we really home in on this. The infighting that takes place within his family, well, it reaches epic proportions that we're going to see next week. It would make those reality TV shows like Big Brother look positively tame compared to the stuff that goes on in Jacob's family. And yet, these are the people that God has decided to set his heart on. What a promise. Look at verse 15 again. All of God's people received this promise. That was Jacob at that moment. Behold, I am with you. I will keep you. I will bring you back. I will not leave you until everything that I've promised is true. What does that mean in the end? Well, for Jacob, in the middle of verse 15, we'll bring you back. I will bring you back to this land. And indeed, Jacob did get brought back. He got brought back to this place, this house of God, this gate of heaven. I will bring you back. I mean, here is God promising ultimately to bring Jacob back to himself, to the place where he is. This is a promise to bring his people to heaven. And as I said, I mean, this was personal to Jacob. And yet, wonderfully, this is the promise that God consistently makes with his people through other places in the Old Testament, and of course, very clearly, as Jesus himself promises the disciples and all who would follow him, I will be with you. I will not leave you. We think of God, don't we, to our own detriment, as cheering on the sidelines, vaguely interested, leaving me to get on with my life. But God is very much involved. God very much cares. And so as we continue to do battle with lockdown, with the virus, with the implications of the virus and the various laws and guidance and the hardened hearts and relationships that are under strain, I think one of the things that I've noticed hugely over the last over the last 3 or 4 months particularly, is because so many things that we're used to have been stripped away, there is a particular focus on some of the things that we're involved in. And that has given the devil an opportunity to get in all sorts of ways. I'm aware of more tension now within the church family and within sort of related relationships than there has been for many, many years before. There's no doubt, as many of you tell me, you feel under pressure. Well, look, here is truth to deal with pressure. God is committed. He's not detached. He knows, he cares. He has our lives in his hand. It's possible to think, isn't it, that God could only be involved in my life and what I'm up to if there was something in my life that made it useful to God. Jacob proves that that is rubbish. If God chooses to protect and bring a rat bag like Jacob back to heaven, well, you can be sure that there's nothing that you have done that would ever rule you out of God's commitment to you. Here is the God who in the first instance is not asking you to tick boxes and to rush off and do things for him. Here is a God who is not asking you to do anything more than to get to know him and his commitment. What a refreshing contrast to the world's religions and their worksy demands. Here is a God who does everything. Our job, to get to know him, to trust him. God is committed to his people. Well, why don't you just take a moment to think about some personal implication for you and something that maybe you want to discuss with somebody else. I'm going to hand back to Mike in just a moment, but why don't we just pause for a moment's thought, and then I'll close us in a short prayer. Praise you, Heavenly Father, for your commitment to us. Thank you as we look back to these foundational times for humanity, foundational for your people. We can see your clear commitment, the way that you reveal yourself, your promises which stand true even today, and the way that you care about us personally, individually. We long for that day when we will be with you in heaven. And until then, we do ask that you will help us to cope with the pressures and stresses and to help us to grow in our understanding and our trust of you. In Jesus' name, amen.